Welcome to the Self-Intelligence Podcast, where I have radically honest and heart-opening conversations with amazing people who are willing to share their stories and information that can have a profound impact on your life. The number of people suffering from mental health conditions is increasing at unprecedented levels. The question for those suffering with their mental health is, am I broken and need external intervention like medication and ongoing therapy to manage the symptoms? Or is the mental health condition a symptom of something that is within your control that can be healed through inner work practices, skills, and habits that result in mental stability? Or is a combination of both necessary? My guest today has struggled with symptoms and behaviours that closely represent ADHD. His psychologist also agrees with his suspicions, but he is yet to be given a formal diagnosis from a specialist. Luke has come onto the podcast to discuss his recent findings and to open up a broader conversation about how to approach mental health challenges from a self-intelligence perspective. A huge thank you to Luke for his courage in sharing his experience, which may be life-changing to anyone with a mental health condition, and deeply insightful for anyone who wants to understand more about mental health and the different approaches that can be taken when working through it. Right, thank you, Luke, for coming on to the Self-Intelligence Podcast to discuss a mental health challenge or issue that seems to be impacting more and more people, more and more children. We're talking about ADD or ADHD, which have seemed to be clumped together now with some variations in that. I do want to start by saying we're not experts per se in like the medical version or, understanding specifically on this. There is some background understanding that we're going to go into, but it is a unusual topic to be brought up when it comes to self-awareness or mindfulness, self-discovery, self-inquiry, the topics that are involved in self-intelligence, because it brings up what's come up a few times for me around when a mental disorder, which can be coming from the ego state, gets then turned into physiological, biological, to the DNA level, thought to be as a problem that can only really be treated maybe in a medical way or like with medications and things like this. And it's like, where does that all make sense to each other, right? How does all this come together and converge and be supportive holistically together? So this is a really important subject. And I've had, Luke's a good friend of mine. I've had another friend of mine tell me he was recently diagnosed with ADHD as well as an adult. So this is affecting a lot of people, and I'm sure there's those seeking support, help, education. How can we deal with this stuff, right? So tell me a bit about your journey of getting to the place of being diagnosed, or what sort of
Well, I mean, that's probably important, I guess. I haven't actually been like clinically diagnosed. You got to go and spend hundreds of dollars at a psychiatrist who's going to, supposedly can diagnose those sorts of things. But, the funny thing is I started pondering about this based on a bunch of videos that I'd watched of people who are describing the sort of constellation of traits that someone with ADHD suffers from. And and they're going through this, and I'm just watching it like, fuck, that's like everything, every single source of suffering that I have navigated, that all aligns up. And so I actually went to my psychologist about this and like got her opinion, and she was pretty much on board as well. She was like, look, without actually formally diagnosing, like, and she's known me a long time, and she says, I can see where you're coming from. And that led to like, okay, well, what do we do about that? And, there's you got to get clinically diagnosed to actually get access to the drugs they currently use, which are essentially just amphetamines from what I understand. So they they're like speed to a degree. And then there's some dietary things you can go through. I tried some supplements that seem to help fairly well. But then it came to this like, well, beyond all of that, she asked me, what other things could I explore? What else would I do about it? And that's when it sort of the thought came to me of like, well, yeah, how would my identification with these things being stuff that happens to me, how much of this could I use awareness and self-inquiry to alleviate some of this? And it's conflicting because, like you said, a lot of this does seem to be, I mean, ADHD essentially is classified as this like lack of dopamine. So a lack of ability to, someone put it in a funny way. It's like having erectile dysfunction of the mind, where you can't, you can see the thing you want or the goal or the idea, but can't muster the drive to go through with it. And so there's like a dysfunction in that sense. And there's some clear, from what I understand, there's clear chemical aspects to that. And so, yeah, but on the same sense, all of it, a lot of the behavior that comes out of it is a constant desire for stimulus to appease that dopamine imbalance. So that looks like, phone use or pornography or food or whatever it is that can get that short-term quick dopamine increase. And a lot of that seems to mess with this a sort of escaping from just being still, like just having stillness instead. And stillness, not just in the sense of sitting still, but stillness in the stillness of mind in undergoing a task, to watch the distraction and watch the way the mind wants me to go elsewhere, but stay with the task anyway. And so it kind of falls into this willpower thing. And so I was curious, whether you'd come across this before and navigated it and from that perspective.
Well, I mean, I've looked at some of the symptoms of ADHD, and it's almost like everyone I've spoken to as a coach, for example, who's ever wanted to achieve anything and has come up against everything you just mentioned, could almost diagnose themselves, not, as we can all do with the internet these days, diagnose ourselves with so many different things. But this is what I wanted to talk about and just sort of flesh out as a conversation, because when you're talking about attention and you're talking about will, then you're talking about spirituality. And when you have the idea that may have some relative truth, may not, we've got to remember straight away, because something can be diagnosed doesn't make it a fact, doesn't make it a reality in itself, doesn't make it understood on so many levels. Things that are scientifically looked at in certain ways are constantly themselves in states of change and flux. And also within the industry itself, there'd be so many different opinions and beliefs and observations about this that don't make any sense to each other. Okay. So we've got to start there, because the start is often in our society, particularly the Western society, that science is stable and is factual, and it's just so not. It is relative and impermanent and ever-changing based on what we, continually discover about things. And we do our best with that relative information, right, of course, but it's not a fact. So certain people may experience a mental health disorder, which is, I guess you could lump this into like the whole spectrum of mental health.
Yeah.
And go, you know what? I reckon I can do something about this. I reckon I can train myself. I reckon I can employ certain skills and behaviors and whatever the case. And I'm not going to live with this for the rest of my life. And others will take the position that there's something fundamentally wrong with my brain, wrong with my chemical balance, and therefore I need to be medicated and supported in a certain way in order to function and live. And this is the challenge. How do you know when something is based in biology on its sort of in an isolated kind of way. And this also relates to things like anxiety disorders. People are coming out with anxiety disorders. Like kids are being able to now take time off school a lot because of anxiety, for example, which we didn't have that kind of thing when we were younger. That was like a, hey, miss, put up your hand. I've got anxiety. I'm going to go home. It was you had to feel like you're going to vomit or something like this, in the past. Depression, phobias, OCD disorders. There's many different mental health challenges. Addiction. We could go on and on and on. That a lot of people have overcome in their own way, like or healed in ways that weren't believable, say from a scientific perspective in some cases. And of course, all of that gets all diagnosed up into different nuanced areas as well. It's like, yeah, certain depression can be treated, but some depression can't be treated. Like this is, if it's like this type of depression, clinical depression, and this is, you've got to do this for that. But if it's like da-da-da-da, and it all gets sectioned off. But even with all of that, that is not entirely true, and there have been major shifts and transformations for people within those spectrums as well. And oftentimes when someone does come through something that goes against the narrative that's happening in the world of whatever's being diagnosed to be permanent, is just not looked at. It's just like, I don't want to look at that, because how are we supposed to make sense of that?
Yeah.
How are we supposed to make sense of this thing? And so I find that there can be a very complementary, connection of both things, but it's the understanding of when you're working on one thing over here, you know what you're working on and you're clear about what you're working on, say whether that's with depression or anxiety or whatever the case is, that you're educated in how you are doing that work that's supporting that, so that if there are other aspects involved that are chemical and so on, then you can let those things be supported as well, and it can all work together.
Yeah.
But what I find is there's not an understanding of what the inner work actually is, because we don't get taught inner work at school. If you get depression, which everyone gets depressed at certain times depending on circumstances and whatever the case, or you get anxiety and things like this, there has been little, if any, direct skill-based or habit-based training on how to deal with that stuff, as though we know how to deal with that stuff, right? You didn't get a class of that at school. I didn't.
No.
So can you imagine then how confused people must be when they have developed a disorder, so to speak, that is totally repairable through different habits and so on, but how can they discern that? I've just been told, and I've gone under, this process of diagnosis, that this is what I've got. I've got this, and now
it's often coming from a place of authority as well, and that can lump them. You end up in a place of hopelessness because there's seemingly no other option.
Yes. And I've experienced this because I've gone through various different things. I was diagnosed with depression at one point, which was actually more like an anger issue because of a relationship challenge with my father. I was given, medication that really warped my mind, actually. It really caused some issues, and it took me a long time to wean off that. But it was so clearly circumstantial. Do you see? It was so clearly circumstantial, but the circumstances and the way that I was perceiving those circumstances, there was very little understanding how to address that stuff. The doctors didn't know how to address it. My counselor didn't know how to address it, because I also had a counselor at school who was trying to help me out as well. None of them knew how to address this at the level that it had to be addressed. You see, and then I was diagnosed with a medication like this, and also like a label of depression or whatever the case. And, that could have gone further, and it was spiraling, and it would have gone further to greater degrees of depth of that, entrenchment of that, which is really sad, because something in me, I'm not sure where it came from. I'm not sure how it even happened, but something in me knew I'm going to heal this within myself. Something was there, a sense of responsibility. And then guess what? The appropriate mechanisms to support me started to become revealed, even though I didn't know anything about them, right? Which was like meditation. I actually learned from a Buddhist meditation teacher to begin with at the very beginning. Like lots has evolved since then, but it was the start point of bringing my attention. We were talking about attention, deficit disorder, bringing my attention to a place I was never told ever in my life I could even put my attention, right? So place your attention here, and then something shifts in your brain chemistry. I mean, all this has been scientifically looked at as well, what happens in these states of meditation and so on. And all of a sudden, I was able to, through that, to start to choose and take different action and remove myself from certain reactions that were perpetuating this inner state of rage and wounding that I experienced. So a healing was starting to take place, you see.
Well, this is the interesting thing. The nuance of this is that ADHD is essentially saying there's an attention deficit. There's an issue with attention, but it's actually not that clear, because there are certain things that if they're very engaging to me, or they're very interesting to me, and they're interesting to me for whatever reason, my ability to pay attention is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if it's a really great video game, or it's a skill I want to learn, or if there's something that is very important to me or the I or myself, then the ability to apply attention is astronomical. So it's not a disability in attention. It's that it's very selective and it becomes very narrow. And in those moments of great attention, the being interrupted is so frustrating. It's very, very irritating. And it can only seemingly focus on very few things at once.
Let's look at the term that you just used that's important to this conversation, to anyone who's listening who's suffering a mental health disorder themselves, of whatever kind that may look like. The word selective. This is such an important term when it comes to labeling yourself with something, because like you said, under certain circumstances or certain environments, or when your certain values are being met, or whatever the case is, all of a sudden, I don't have any issue with attention. But put me in a different situation. When I was reading through the symptoms of kids who've got ADHD, and they were talking about like not able to concentrate in class and interrupting and doing this thing and that, I'm like, well, firstly, it sounded like myself when I was a kid, right? Straight up.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty convinced I would have been like, at least there would have been concern that I had this when I was growing up. And what essentially that was about was I had fundamentally no interest in what I was being taught, because it itself was not fundamental enough for me to be interested. So it was like this, do that, learn like a monkey kind of thing. That did not interest me at all. It didn't go into anything fundamental, so I couldn't find it important. Because I couldn't find it important, I couldn't keep my attention to it. And yet every single day was this barrage of what to me was this nonsense information that I just wouldn't commit myself to. So, and because there was a lot of energy, I was extremely disruptive. I was a clown in the class, was constantly causing problems for the teachers. I was constantly asking questions. I was not respectful because I didn't respect them. I didn't respect them, so I wasn't respectful. And that would just cause more and more and more problems. And man, I think if they could have medicated me back then just to like ease their suffering of all the disturbance I was causing, they probably would have.
Yeah. Well, I think this is what's changing, if I understand, is that, if you look at those lists of symptoms, you can see that, you could imagine anyone experiencing those things. It's like, it's just that shit, it happens. But it's defining when that constellation of things gets to a point where it becomes it's disrupting one's life. And I think this is where it gets interesting, because what in that situation, the disruption is that child not being able to engage in an environment that it's just not engaging. Now, I used to be a school camp instructor years ago, and I would have teachers so the kids would arrive, and then you get your group of kids, and we used to take them out into the bush for 3 days at a time and do higher ups activities and all sorts of shit. And I would have teachers come to me and be like, look, I just want to give you a heads up about Timmy, because Timmy is a fucking asshole and and he's going to cause issues, just so you know. That kid almost every single time ended up being the superstar of the week, because all of a sudden he was in an environment where he could be the leader. He could solve more complex problems that, you know, were put in front of them, and it was just a different engaging environment that they just shined in, you know. And then you had kids who, I would always bring a guitar on camp, and then you had the kid who was like the secret guitar genius. In school, no one liked the kid, but all of a sudden he's now the, you know, most popular kid in the group because he's whacking out tunes around the campfire of an evening. It was like, holy crap, who knew that old mate could do that? And so this is the thing. It's like everyone can fall into those symptom categories, but it's only when it's getting in the way of what we perceive to be what you should be able to do within society, and then it becomes a disorder. Because the thing is, there's some superpowers around this shit. Like, I can connect dots. For me, when I work on, because I do remedial massage and I'm trying to deal with people's pain issues, my ability to, in the moment, attend to the complexity of that situation, it really aids me in that situation. You know, so there's places where it becomes an almost superpower, and then there's places where I flop because I struggle to muster the length of attention needed, you know, over, you know, days, weeks, months, whatever it is. So it's selective when it's a disorder.
Tell us a bit about, I mean, there's a lot to go into here, isn't there? But we're going to come to it from a self-intelligence perspective. When have you noticed not being able to follow through on things? Like, what are some of the patterns that you've noticed?
It's like a very quick overwhelm. So, for example, like, there's some things around pain and stress and the connection of those things that if I could go and do, you know, 4, 5, 6 years of university and degree and get into research and have the facility and the resources to investigate that further from a biomechanical, chemical perspective, and I feel like I would know what questions to begin to ask, go down that road. But the fact that the thought that I'd have to go through all of that to get to this thing that's really interesting to me, it's like the brain just goes, yeah. It's that, you know, the sexual erectile dysfunction thing is actually quite accurate, because it just flop and then go looking for something immediately interesting.
Okay, so because this is the painful truth for a lot of people who are suffering mental disorders and medicating themselves for, which is actually what I see to be a lack of initiation from childhood to adulthood, where there is this instant gratification requirement, which is the child. The child goes for instant gratification, and as we get older, our priorities change and our values change and our ability to vision and so on changes. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to pursue something that takes time and is also in many cases uncomfortable. So who can, just listening to this, recognize you've ever had an idea or something you wanted to do, like Luke said, and then the thought of the time that it's going to take and the energy it's going to take, also there with no certainty that it's going to happen either.
Yeah.
Because you could fail the whole way. You could fail. You know, you could not pass your exams. Something could happen, right? And you're not getting where you wanted to get. And all of that floods in soon after the inspiration. And it's like, too hard, can't do that. I've lost energy. I feel like I'm literally got the plug pulled out of my, you know, my energy, as you were saying with the erectile dysfunction. Everybody can relate to that, right? Everybody can relate to that experience. And yet someone would suggest, but if it gets to a certain stage of that, then we've got to classify this thing as whatever the diagnosis might look like.
Yeah, instead of going, okay, what's step one? My brain goes, here's the 1,000 steps it would take to get to that thing. And it's just immediate overwhelm. And so the brain just goes, whoa, we're not fucking going to try and navigate all of that.
So when you talk, let's just talk about that for a second. You're using the term my brain, right?
Yeah.
So there's the me and then there's my brain. Let's just look at this. Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Is it you or is it your brain? Or is it both, or where do you sit with that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the interesting part of coming at it from this perspective is like I'm very aware of the fact that all of the impulses, sensations, and things that I feel are not who I am, and I have a capacity to choose otherwise. Like I go and get in an ice bath most mornings, and the thought of doing that is far worse than actually getting in the thing.
Yeah.
And once it's done, it's fantastic. And so, I know I have, and everyone has, the capacity to go, okay, I feel and hear from my brain what it wants to do, but I'm going to do this instead. I'm going to go down this way instead. So there's a capacity to do that. What it feels like is the capacity to do that is diminished in situations where there's overwhelm like that.
Yes. So when you talk about capacity, I like this term because this term capacity has a lot to do with preparedness and building strength in a certain way. So for example, with attention, when it comes to meditation, you are developing the capacity to hold attention in a certain way, right? Yeah. Whereas when people first start meditation, it's like they all got ADD or ADHD. I asked them, I did this for years, 7 years, every Wednesday night I was teaching beginner meditation. And I'd say, okay, the first thing I want you to try is to sit still. Just sit still. If you have an itch or you have this thing happening, whatever, you only just need to witness that. Don't go for it. Don't try to do anything with it. Now, do you think they had the capacity? Even though those instructions are very simple, everybody is itching their face and their leg and wriggling and moving because they right now don't have the capacity to hear the instruction and follow it at this point. But in about 4 weeks' time, all of a sudden, they'd have the impulse to move their arm and scratch their face or something. And now there's a capacity to witness that process and just sit still and not allow that to happen, right? So they were developing a capacity. Yes.
No, and I think you're onto it when, there's a big influx of what's being diagnosed as adult ADHD, and it's coming to that thing because it's like, oh, we missed it at a young age, or it just didn't show up until you're an adult now. But what's more likely the case is that ability and capacity to do these things hasn't been developed. That's how I more feel about it, is that I missed something along the way that would otherwise have given me a better capacity to do that. Because I don't not have the capacity. I can do this. It's just that as soon as the capacity is not as much as it maybe could be, meaning that more challenging, longer term, there's a difference between sitting for 10 seconds and sitting for an hour, in meditation, for example. And so it lands in this place where it's like, okay, does that mean that I could build that capacity, and would that make sense? Or is there a level of acceptance here that there's a limitation I'm gonna have, and that's fine, and because there's pros and cons to it, and I don't suffer from it enormously, and I can navigate it, and part of that is an acceptance of like, I'm not mystified and hopeless about it. It's just it is what it is in some cases. And so use my superpowers and try and live my life in using all of that. So there's kind of two ways that I think about going down the road with that.
If you would like to download a free beginner self-recognition guided meditation audio to start your journey of healing and freeing yourself from the inside out, see the link in the description or go to selfintelligence.com. When I hear you speak about it, my intuition is you have the capacity to develop. Yeah. You have the ability to develop the capacity that would remove this altogether as an idea that this is who you are. There's a sense of that. There's a sense of that for me. I don't know that as a fact, but that's when I speak to you, and I know you more personally as well, if you like. Because when there's the impulse to grow and to fulfill certain values and to expand, there is these what feels like journeys of or mountains to climb, right? That essentially get started by your curiosity. And your curiosity then meets up with your natural gifts and natural talents and so on. And then there's now this journey to behold that feels really, yes, overwhelming and too hard and like, how could I possibly? And it's like the hero's journey's just started. And each step of the hero's journey, if anyone's aware of Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey and so on, there are these monsters that you face, which essentially come down to addictions and distractions and fears and belief systems and conditioning and all of this stuff that essentially tells you you can't. Your identity, who you are, is not going to make this journey, right? And then it calls you to bring in masters and teachers and learnings and abilities and so on that support you to let go of what's necessary, because it's always a letting go process, the whole thing, in order to make this journey, right? And then there's this like, do I tell myself I'm just not capable of this journey? Like maybe I can manage myself in sort of like a comfortable nightmare that I can kind of like approach a little bit, like I can go there to some extent, but essentially I'm going to recoil when I hit one of those gatekeepers, right? One of those doubts, one of those fears, one of those judgments, one of those deeply entrenched conditioning, and then just pin that on some diagnosis, right? I can do that. Or is the diagnosis coming with me on the journey itself? And it's not the bigger picture, or it's not the excuse. It's actually the lever for the journey. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Because how many people in the world have shown to be able to do miraculous things? Why is it called miraculous? Because it goes outside of the diagnosis. It goes outside of the prognosis, right? Yeah. It goes outside of what anyone believed was possible. How could this person under these circumstances somehow managed to achieve or to do whatever the case? It doesn't seem human. It's like they got superpower. But what's the difference between them and the other is they decided that's what they were going to do. Somehow they weren't going to settle for anything less than fulfilling that journey, if you like. And they defy what we think is normal and expected, basically. And I think there's something in everybody that wants to experience that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I've been through multiple times where I've landed in something that's grabbed my drive and my interest. And I think, this is it. This is where I'm going to pursue this now. This is where I'm devoted to now. But every single time it fizzles out. And I don't know whether that's just like, it's like honeymoon period in the same sense, right? Of like, there's an initial drive and then it's like, okay, but now it's time to do the not so pretty, not so fun, not as engaging part of this. process towards that envisaged thing that could change. But yeah, it's that as soon as it lands in that place, the mind is very quick to start to propose various other much quicker forms of stimulation. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also where everybody asks themselves, like, because there's so much doubt, right? There's so much doubt with everything you just said. If anyone feels the curiosity to pursue a certain path or whatever, instantly doubt is there for everyone. The fear of failure, caring about what other people think, not feeling you're enough, all the usual suspects, come up, all to generate this sense of doubt. And it creates so much discomfort. And it's so strong and so believed that it actually turns into like this question, is there something wrong with me? Like, is there something actually just wrong with me? That this is what will happen. And then unfortunately, there are people out there more than not that will agree, that would say there's something, there's something wrong with you and we need to do this for you because that you're not normal and whatever the case is, right? And that's the part I find sad. That's the part I find like that would be believed because in so many cases, probably more often than not, it's just not true. And you got to tune in for that for yourself. But I've done a lot of work with people and supported people and encouraged people even to take medications at times when necessary in the process of the whole journey I'm talking about. I've got no issue against any of that stuff. But what I do have a challenge with is believing something that limits that inherent impulse to grow and expand. And then there's like, I'm going to suppress that and limit that for these ideas. Like, do you know what I'm trying to say with that? If you would like to discover who you really are beyond the voice in your head and emotional states that cause relationship drama, stress, health issues, procrastination, sabotage, addictions, essentially all the drama and personal problems you can think of, come and join me for the Wake Up Experience, which is the first step in freeing yourself from the inside out. See the link in the description for more details.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, because, like I said, the capacity's there. And this just sort of drops in for me at the moment is like at one point I was looking at joining the army or the army reserves. I was, and that landed in me because what I was wanting to get out of that was to be given, to be laid a path. Because if it's like, okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and then you'll get to this point, and then you'll have this thing, and then you're going to do that and that and that, and there's discipline involved in it. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff about the military I deplore, but there's a lot of stuff about the military in terms of discipline and whatnot that I was like, that's where I could get this. That's a place where I could potentially be in an environment where I'm going to gain these skills that I haven't gained through my development so far. It's like an institution to imbue those things. And the reflection on that was like, it's not that I don't have the capacity, it's that I don't currently have the environment that it's like, okay, right now I don't know, or I'm struggling to put the drive together to do these things, to develop these, to mature essentially. And it seems that it's very difficult to try and mature myself, and that I desire an environment that's going to cultivate that, and doesn't seem that it is. I can't see it. And for me, the one who needs to be, like, it's like children trying to raise children. It doesn't work. And I feel like that's the stuckness that this is. And I think it's what actually is being diagnosed as adult ADHD is actually just immaturity that doesn't have a place to go and mature, to be provided that environment to do that, this coming of age process that we don't really have.
Well, we do.
That seems more accurate.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying because I've felt for a long time that initiation is missing in our culture. brings about the discomfort that's necessary to move past the childish phase into a more adult phase where you are not expecting to be saved or the pain taken off you or the challenge taken away from you, but that you are to bear witness and go through, not around or over under, but through something and discover that you are beyond all of that stuff. And I went into the army as reserves, for example, myself when I was 18 years old, and it was 6 weeks of grueling hell that I didn't know I was capable of going through. That certainly showed me something about myself, but that didn't even close to compare to what I've done with the internal work. And society, particularly our society, does not facilitate the responsibility of inner work. You have to pursue that. And like, I have a community of people that come together on a weekly basis to provide them that environment that you're talking about, because it's like, I need to be able to do that regularly and show up regularly, not to go off into these torrents of thoughts that derail my aspirations, right? Because all that is a constant like shame building exercise. Every time that you go to pursue something and then you come up against those blockages and go for instant gratification, you've also just taken on a whole bunch of the vibration of shame with that as well. And so it's getting heavier and heavier and heavier in that sense. And people start to realize that and go, I'm required to be supported, to be interrupted in that process, and also instructed to bring in the habits and the skills that prevent that from happening. I just this week, Luke, like looking at another course that I'm running at the moment and looking at the whole business in a different way. And there's things that are dropping in. It was like diabolically uncomfortable. Like it felt like unreasonable, like treachery. Like basically what it was what I was, I could not in my mind at all work out a way forward. If that makes sense. There was no possible way forward in my mind. And when there's no possible way forward in your mind, it's hopeless. And when it's hopeless, then there's frustration and anger and then feeling like a victim and then giving up. And there's all these really typical energies that will come. But because I'm trained and because I have the habits and because I have the skills, I know that this part of the journey that I'm in is specifically to bring that up. That's its purpose. It's not the problem and it's not in the way. It is the purpose itself, you see. But if I didn't have that, I'd just give up because it's like literally unbearable. It feels unbearable. Does that make sense? Like I cannot do this. Like all of those voices are coming in and they're coming in hot. And that because what's happening and what I understand for myself and experience many times over is there's an expansion happening and the identity I'm in right now is not going to survive the expansion. So I'm trying to hold on to my identity while it's being destroyed in a sense at the same time, you see? And when you have a community around you that's supporting these processes to understand, it can come in at that time and go, just step back, just step a foot back. Don't listen. Don't be so invested in what you're feeling and what you're thinking right now, because tomorrow it's all going to reintegrate and reorganize. Particularly when you go to sleep, things just reorganize. And all of a sudden, what seemed like there was no possible answers and like completely screwed, some clarity, like light will come through and then this thing happens. And then you're the next step, like so to speak, like you've taken a step. But it's right in those moments because of not being disciplined in this way, mature in this way, as you said, mature, it hits there. It's just believed, and then it's go back to what I know. Go back to what I have already found ground, because guess what? You've already made so much ground in your life already. If you're a practitioner and a therapist and doing all this sort of stuff, you've had to go through this. You've had to be disciplined. You've had to do all that.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, growth certainly has, as I said, the capacity is there.
Yes.
And, you know, because I have some experience in thinking about it in this way, I certainly don't suffer greatly from it. Like I'm quite content in the way my life is. However, the behaviors that show up that reflect the immaturity, that gets in the way of things like the ability to like save up for a house, or like I can quite, and have done my whole life, navigated everything in a last minute dash kind of a fashion, and I've gotten really good at that, and it's got me where I am, and I've just walked that path. But I I think like I'm drawn to have kids at some point in the near future, and I sometimes think about how irresponsible it could be to like take on that kind of a task if I myself are not really, if I feel that I'm not fully developed and matured into adulthood myself. So there's like distant things that I know that will eventually be a problem if if growth doesn't happen. But perhaps I'm able to also just distract myself from not worrying about that. And I don't know. It could be a Goldilocks zone right now. Everything is fine, but yeah, I don't know.
Well,
Yeah,
the what you do know is, like you say, there are certain feelings to expand and to grow and to participate in life in a certain way, but the distractions and the addictions and the things that are taking place for you are becoming barriers to that, right? I mean, that's what you are aware of. And then it's like understanding that each step of the way is an identity crisis. And the identity that wants to be held on to is in a childlike state in certain ways.
Yeah.
Not completely, but there's that there. And
yeah,
then there's a natural impulse to mature and to grow up. And that's inherently fulfilling because it's natural and it's uncreated. It just is innate. And there's these barriers inside: thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, conditioning, experiences, past experiences, all of that make a distortion on what is natural. And then so you're sort of in your own way, if that makes sense. And this is where that saying comes, like, you got to get out of your own way. And then the question is, but what if it's not that I'm in the way? What if I have a mental health condition that causes this? This is where the conversation rounding itself, you see, because that question, I find it to be in so many cases like abusive. To even entertain it like that is like something for me, and that feels really deeply disturbingly off.
I mean, I'm fortunate that I was able to walk into that investigation without that happening because of the way I was able to think about these things. But I can see that. I can see how that, and this thing, like I see, because I deal with these people all the time on my table. I mean, they inevitably end up musculoskeletally unwell, but there's a common thread through many of them in the one that, particularly ones that their bodies are just breaking down, in that they are, and getting to know them and talking to them, and it inevitably happens, but they are too still just very childlike in many ways. And so the thing is, like, right now I'm fine, and my life's great, and I'm doing well, and everything else. However, if I feel like if I don't, there's this sort of risk or this idea in my mind of like, if I don't take the steps to the growth needed to mature further, is there a point in the future where it's just not going to work anymore? And it's all just a future idea of what could be the case. But
the preemptive strike on your on your future suffering.
But but it's based in observation of thousands of people and there's threads that seem to fall between them all, and it's very relatable. I mean, there's people making literally their business or their hustle is like making money through these Instagram, YouTube videos about the fact that they have these disorders, and this is what it's like to have them, and these are the things I suffer from. And it's entertainment, and it's so. But the reason it's so successful is because it's so relatable to so many. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the attention. So there's clearly like a thread here that is common enough that it can generate enough of an audience to actually make money. So there's there's something going on that I also relate to and resonate. And so at the same time, I'm not in all this pain that would normally drive like a need for change. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Well, yeah, this is where you gotta follow your heart and your integrity, like that sense of integrity, which of course is also a growing up thing. It doesn't necessarily need things to be painful at a certain suffering level where you have to make a change or anything like that.
Yeah.
There's just something like a sense of rightness in yourself. Something feels mature, more grown up, and there's something that, there's a sense of rightness in that, and you can be subtle about that.
I think that's the thing. I think it's the nature of it, and I've thought about this a lot in like what it is to be mature or to be an adult. And there's a quality there of conscious choice outside of impulse driven. The very act of choosing to take steps to grow, to mature in every facet of what that would look like, in itself is a mature thing to do, because it's choosing to take a step towards something that's not from an impulse or a reaction, but from a exploration of growth.
Yeah.
And then the thing of like, yeah, I could do that, or just go back to this more entertaining thing that's happening right now.
Yes, but you won't feel right about it. It's as simple as that. Just that simple. It's like I could jump back on Netflix and do this thing, or I could do whatever the case, some distraction or whatever. And everybody knows there's a place for all of that. There's a place for what can be termed as addictions and distractions. That it doesn't work like that at all. It's just a part of enjoyment of life and having a balance thing, and playing a video game here and there and watching a movie and doing this and that. But there's a point where I'm avoiding stuff. Like this is not that. There is a reason in a way to be concerned, because if you're avoiding what's right in yourself, there's fear. And if there's fear that's unresolved, you will generate what you fear to experience it, to resolve it. So all you have to do is move toward that rightness, and it will bring those fears up, but in a more subtle way, less intense way. And then, you're sort of getting that sense of fulfillment in that growth process naturally, which is always about letting go of your current sense of self.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we want to mature? Because we're identified as we are now, and we don't know who we'd be as the other. We don't know who we'd be.
Yeah.
It's always this. And the conversation of identity crisis in mental health, I don't hear much of that.
Well, I mean, I think I literally said that exact statement of like, I'm good where I'm at, in my own words.
Yes.
And so that, there does seem to be like there's a need. The choice can be made at some point to, I guess, forever and always throughout growth, throughout a lifetime, there's a place needed within, the goings on of any given week, day, month, whatever, to keep pursuing something that is going to keep me growing. There has to be some pursuit of something uncomfortable.
Well, it's only uncomfortable because of everything that it brings up. It's not in itself inherently uncomfortable, because everybody experiences different things totally differently. Do you know what I mean? What's not been that uncomfortable for you, like say doing sessions with people and being a therapist, that can be majorly debilitating for someone else's mind, that they could do something like that. They'd be like petrified of not being enough and doing it wrong and failing and being rejected by clients and not having clients because you're not good enough and da-da-da. Like that can be massively debilitating. And yet for you, that hasn't been like that, So this importance of recognizing the selectivity, of these things, because I want to be clear about those who are suffering mental health of whatever kind. It journeys with you. It's not you, because the mental health situation itself is transient, is changeable in whatever direction it takes.
Yeah.
And there's you, the observer of the condition itself, who's also bearing witness to the impulses of curiosity and growth and alignment that are also there, that this is all now coming up the mountain, walking with you. So it's all together okay. It all can happen. It's not a this or a that situation. That's what it becomes. It's this or it's this,
Yeah.
when it comes to
These
diagnosis.
are hallmarks of a child mind is that of permeance and duality. Of like, this what I feel right now is going to be forever, and it's this or that.
Yep.
And that's the child mind.
Yes, exactly. It's very black and white, isn't it? It doesn't have a lot of perspective, and it certainly doesn't want to take responsibility. So it's like, if you can just give me a track, when people ask me about purpose and that, they say, I've had a lot of people say, Chris, if you just tell me what it is, if you just tell me what it is, I'd do it. I'd 100% commit to it. And it's like, it doesn't work like that at all. It doesn't work like that at all. It's moment to moment. Why is it moment to moment? Because you're realizing there's no such thing as time. That's the maturing. You're coming out of the linear idea of yourself based in a time or as time. And so you have to discover that that's how it works. And it's very painful when it's been taken off you. It just is, because you believe it to be true and it's not. Yeah. So anyone who's feeling the call that it's time to grow up, it's time to grow up. I've had a lot of people tell me they get triggered by this podcast. They get triggered by the things that I talk about. Like, why? Because the child doesn't want to hear any of this. The child's like, screw that guy. Like, nah, I'm not listening to that shit. Do you know what I mean? I prefer to get on what you were talking about and listen to people talking about what they're suffering about and going around in circles, because it at least feels like comfortable in a certain way. Whereas this feels like, oh, I want to fight that, but also I know it's true. Like, also I know deep down there's something true about this. And so I would say, don't dishonor this life with trying to live it out like a comfortable nightmare. Like, learn the lessons, this is life school. Your heart knows what direction to take with it. And it is challenging. My gosh, that's where compassion comes from. People who take the journey only know compassion, not other people, not children. They don't know anything about compassion. They know about sympathy. They know about being a victim. They know about feeling sorry for themselves and sorry for others, but they don't know anything about compassion because they haven't walked it.
Yeah, and it's that thing in a world of so much available comfort that's the environment we find ourselves in. It's no wonder that these things aren't being cultivated to the degree that they could. If we had better institutions around that, self-intelligence is thankfully one of those.
Yeah, and there's lots of different avenues. But the talking, just wrapping this up, the attention deficit that I had came from putting the attention on who I am. And because my attention was everywhere else, and wherever else it went, it was identified. That became the identity. That became my false sense of self. And to come out of that false sense of self and to overcome the challenges on the journey I had to put the attention back to the truth. And then those things were able to pass by, like the storm I was in this week, for example. It could be a storm that went for 3 years if it wasn't to know where to place the attention, you see, and it can cause just a downward spiral, you see. It just can, big time. Yeah. I go have a full panic attack, end up in hospital because certain support, which people do go down that track, and that can totally happen as well. But it's like, it's full on, man, what we're dealing with up here when it comes to life, isn't it? So yeah, I appreciate you bringing this subject up, because I think it's gonna trigger the heart for a lot of people who know, look, I'm resisting something inside me. I'm resisting uncomfortableness and misplacing that on something else that I can kind of excuse that and make excuses for that and not take responsibility. And that's all going to only verify the diagnosis. It's going to ensure that you suffer it. Yeah. So thank you for bringing this up, man. It's huge. This won't be the last time we're talking about this. This is going to come up a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. It's at the heart, isn't it?
It is. It is. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you got value out of this, please share it so that other people can benefit also. If you are fed up with the drama, overwhelm, or suffering going on in your life, and you would like expert guidance and support tailored to your situation, come and be a guest on the Self-Intelligence podcast. Don't go another day confused how to address the challenges you are facing. If you want to be a guest, go to the link in the description below. And for more information about self-intelligence, including joining my next Wake Up experience or detailed information about my self-intelligence course, go to selfintelligence.com.